Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today and talk about a very, very interesting topic that I have to face today. There is no AI or ML regulation in finance yet. There are guidelines, there are best practices, there are draft rules, but we are yet expecting to see the regulation coming out. So, and before I dive into the regulations that we have around the world, I would like to mention, why are we talking about changing what we already have in place? We currently have regulations that regulates banking industry, pension plans, insurance companies, and there are a few factors that kind of triggered by artificial intelligence and machine learning. First of all, it's the complexity of the models. We didn't see so complex models 20, 30 years ago. Right now, we're talking about models that have billions and trillions of parameters. This complexity translates in lack of explainability, and sometimes explainability is critical in financial markets. If you work in the area of credit risk, you can't just say, tell your customer that your loan is declined. You need to explain why. So explainability is critical here. Another critical component is, of course, data. We did not have that much data in that format as we currently have, in particular unstructured data. We're now talking about audio files, we're now talking about video, text, textual information. How do you check the quality of this data as far as completeness is concerned, that I have enough representation of whatever I'm trying to do in the data, in the training data. So all these factors make it very difficult for regulators on the one hand to avoid stifling innovation, and on the other hand to avoid exposing the financial system to systemic risks, to some big risks that could jeopardize the wealth of financial systems around the globe. And one thing, we'll be talking about 5 zonal jurisdictions here. So it's going to be European Union, in Europe and United Kingdom. In Asia, it's going to be Singapore. And in North America, it's going to be the United States and Canada. So these 5 jurisdictions provide a pretty, give a pretty good idea of the complexity of the issue that regulators are now facing. So first is the European Union. As we're aware, last year in April, the European Union came up with draft rules where it split all applications into 4 risk categories. So it's minimal risk, it's limited risk, high risk, and banned applications. So when we talk about spam filters, they seem to have minimal risk. Chatbots, minimal risk, and chatbots have a limited risk. When we talk about social scoring, those are banned by the European Union. It also defines the set of models that fall under the regulation. And of course, the biggest criticism is that it's too prescriptive. For example, Bayesian estimation that we have been using in financial system and just in general for a long time is listed there explicitly. And then the response of the authors of the document was, okay, we have a tiered law enforcement mechanism. So if this Bayesian estimation is used for credit scoring, yes, it will be subject to regulation. It will be heavily scrutinized. If it is used for, say, marketing tools, then probably not, of course. Then we move on to the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, there are 2 documents that were issued this year. The first one that I will start with is the joint effort of the Bank of England and the Financial Conduct Authority, where they had a forum where they engaged private and public participants. And the risk of AI was perceived as stemming from three areas. It's data, it's model, and governance. Governance is something that encapsulates both data and models. As I already mentioned, data comes in a variety of forms, and of course this constitutes a certain risk because banks, insurance companies, pension plans, financial institutions in general, they already have risk management frameworks to deal with data. How do you use them to take into account the fact that we now have a large variety of data? Some of it comes from third parties, and some of it may be just scraped from the web, so there is no one actually to sue if this data is bad. The next one is the model. For the models, of course, it's critical to define what the model is, and then take into account, review the models, have the performance metrics for models, and how often you review those models. For example, we know reinforcement learning has the capacity of learning on the fly. How regularly do you review those models? And I think now the well-known example of that Microsoft bot, Tay, that within 24 hours start uttering some unethical messages. So how to avoid the same situation in finance? So how often do you review your models? And finally, the governance. The governance is takes care of who is responsible for your AI/ML system if they don't perform as expected. What structures? Do you need to create separate roles, like chief ethics officers, chief AI officers, or you just change the functions of existing roles in your organization? So all these issues are discussed in that document. The second document that was issued this year in the UK was the discussion paper. It was issued by the Bank of England, and it contains 5 principles for banks. The critical thing about this document is that the authors explicitly state that this regulation, this discussion paper, was designed to be very in line with the existing model risk management regulation in the banks, so-called, in the States, SR 11.7. So some of the principles are very, very close. And it is this homogeneity that is also critical for regulators right now. We don't want to have different regulations, drastically different regulations around the globe. And we already know that those discrepancies exist. For example, protected variables. Some jurisdictions do not allow to collect them. Some jurisdictions allow to collect protected variables. So talking about this, how do you scale your models? So for companies that run multinationally. So the principles are first model identification and model risk classification. So what is the model? And although the question might seem simple, it is not simple because there are processes and there are models. So where do you draw this line to say, okay, this is model and these are processes? And then, of course, how do you classify your models based on risk? So we here we again see this connection to the risk-based approach that was first suggested by the European Union. Next one is the governance. The same thing. What is stated in the document is that organizations and firms should have a board that set a specific model risk appetite for the organization. Model development and implementation and use, it's a separate issue. That what is required is that there is a robust process of how you develop your models, how you review them, and check their performance. Because new data arrives, is it a different model now when you retrain the same model on new data, or it's the same model? So what is the process here? Next one is the independent model validation. So there should be a separate entity within a financial institution that checks your models independently of the so-called first line of defense. Financial institutions have 3 lines of defense, so second line of defense should be independent from the first line. And this is one of the issues that now kind of debated because many people advocate for actually more engagement and less working in silos between different teams within financial institutions. But then you might endanger this independence of the first line and the second line. So there is a very fine line between the two. And finally, model risk mitigants. So what processes do you have in place if the model does not perform as expected? So these are the 5 principles that are suggested in the discussion, in the consultation paper. And it is also said that these principles will apply to companies that operate there, but not to companies that operate through a branch. So this is different from the EU regulation. Next, we move to Singapore. So it was a very large initiative by the Veritas Consortium that included Monetary Authority of Singapore and different industry partners. It was launched in 2018. It came up with, the goal was to come up with a set of principles that financial institutions can check their models against to see if they comply with all those principles. And those principles are deemed to be critical. So there are 14 principles in total, but those 14 principles are split into 4 core principles that are referred to as FIAT. So it's fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency. These are the 4 principles that they describe in the set of papers, but the final report was published this year. So first, when we talk about fairness, there are 4 principles. First 2 principles basically say if you can justify the fact that you discriminate against a certain population, you're fine. And what we mean here is that justification means, for example, is it fair to have higher risk premiums for young drivers? So on the one hand, they don't have experience, driving experience. On the other hand, they can be considered as a subpopulation that we discriminate against. So if you can justify, in this case it's justifiable, yes, go ahead. And the last 2 principles within this category fall under accuracy and bias. The same thing, accuracy and bias needs to be always keep track on for the models that are considered. So ethics, it's a very broad category. What is ethical, what is not? For ethics, they suggest that as long as you comply with the company regulation, ethical rules, codes of conduct, then you should be fine. And your decisions, AI-based decisions, should be at least as ethical as human-made decisions. Here we have a little bit vague formulation, but at least we have a formulation around such a vague concept as ethics. Accountability. So here they split principles into 2 groups, internal accountability and external accountability. First, the use of AI must be approved by a certain authority within a financial institution. It's the first principle. And a second, there must be a person who is accountable for it, which could be one and the same person. Then the last 2 principles in accountability kind of translate in the next factor, which is transparency. So there should be clear channels to customers on how do they appeal the decisions. And in transparency, there should be ways that people can ask why financial institutions made this decision. There should be public disclosure of the use of AI by the financial institution. Next, move on to the United States. In the United States, yes, lawmakers submitted to the Senate and House of Representatives the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022. So the goal was to bring more oversight and transparency to the use of systems that make those critical decisions. And I will get in a second to what constitutes a critical decision here. So according to the bill, financial institutions who develop, just institutions or vendors who develop or use AI in their business have to conduct assessments of those systems and submit them to the to FTC that will also develop the rules if the bill passes. So what constitutes a critical decision? Again, we see some similarity to the EU Act. It's all those decisions that can significantly impact the life of large demographic groups. So decisions that affect the cost of education, healthcare, legal advice, family advice, employment, all those categories fall under the bill. Now, finally, in Canada. So in Canada, we have the federal regulator, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. They published a discussion paper in 2020 where they outline 3 principles and they seek feedback from financial institutions. And in May this year, they issued an industry letter. So there are 3 categories that they list. So it's soundness, it's explainability, and accountability. So soundness is a very broad category, which encompasses model development, data, model validation, risks that stem from model development and sourcing it from third parties. In explainability, it's also a broad category. It includes transparency as well. So it should be understood how models arrive to their decisions. And here we can talk about post hoc explainability, where you can explain a particular decision or understand how the entire model works. So this is what's often referred in ML as interpretability. And accountability is the last component, where it says that there should be clear accountability and responsibility within an organization. So if something goes wrong, there must be someone who's responsible for it. Finally, we move to Bill C-27. Part 3 of the bill states is devoted to Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. That is an attempt to regulate federal privacy law in Canada. And it applies only to private sector. According to the bill, companies will have to assess, so first, identify, assess and mitigate the risks of harm and biased output. There should be a certain disclosure of the algorithm of their intended and actual use if those systems are developed and deployed. So I'm wrapping up here. So thank you, but like what is the commonality because in those across jurisdictions? First, we see it's explainability, accountability, ethics, bias. All these components, they kind of must be incorporated into regulation whenever it comes out. And as we see, it's far from clear how you actually define all those concepts so that they do not have any adverse consequences on the financial system. Now, thank you.